Story 1. The Watchman of Angel Hill. Jose Santana. Jose Santana had always been a man of few words. Born and raised in Belo Horizonte, he had taken the position of watchman at Angel Hill Cemetery over 10 years ago. The job was quiet, except for the rumors surrounding the place. People said the cemetery housed more than just bodies. Ancient legends claimed that on winter nights, restless souls wandered the hill, but Jose never believed those stories. It was a cold, silent July night when Jose began his usual rounds. The wind was sharp, blowing through the trees and making the dry leaves whisper among the graves. The flashlight in his hand illuminated the path ahead, revealing the damp gleam of the fog that was beginning to form. He walked through the marble and granite corridors as he did every night, always paying attention to details, though he had never seen anything unusual. However, that night the silence felt different. There was an oppressive stillness, as if even the crickets had decided not to sing. Something wasn't right. When he reached the highest part of the cemetery, where the mausoleums of wealthy families stood tall, he heard a distant noise. It sounded like footsteps, but they were hesitant, as if someone was trying not to be noticed. Jose stopped, directing his flashlight toward the gravel path behind him. Nothing. The sound ceased as soon as he turned. The chill running down his spine made him grip the flashlight handle tighter, but he pushed the fear aside, believing it might just be a nocturnal animal wandering through the cemetery. He continued his walk, passing by the oldest graves. Most dated back to the early 20th century, and many headstones were worn by time. When he was about to finish his rounds, Jose noticed something he had never seen before. The door of an old mausoleum was slightly ajar. He was sure that place had always been locked. That structure was famous, as it housed the Abreu family, victims of a tragedy more than 100 years ago. With his flashlight trembling in his hands, Jose approached slowly. The mausoleum door appeared to have been forced open. Vandals, he thought, cursing the irresponsibility of whoever had invaded that sacred place. But when he touched the iron door, a strange sensation ran through his body. The metal was too cold for a night like that, almost like ice. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door, which creaked in protest. The sound echoed among the graves, and he stepped inside the mausoleum. The light from his flashlight illuminated the dark and dusty interior. In the center lay the large marble sarcophagus of the Abreu family, covered in cobwebs and forgotten by time. However, something was wrong. Jose felt a chill run down his skin when he noticed that the sarcophagus was slightly open. Just a small crack, but enough to reveal something he should never have seen. He approached, the sound of his breathing echoing in the confined space. When he lifted the lid with effort, what he saw inside made him recoil in horror. The body inside the sarcophagus was not a dried-up mummy from the passage of time, but a fresh corpse. The pale skin, the closed eyes, the face was in perfect condition, as if the person had died only hours ago. Horror overtook Jose, but he forced himself not to run. He knew that if he panicked, he could make mistakes. However, before he could think of his next move, the radio in his pocket started to hiss, emitting a low sound, as if it were picking up a distant transmission. He pulled the radio from his pocket and tried adjusting the frequency, but the more he fiddled with it, the louder the static became, until suddenly voices began to echo. They were not clear voices but distorted, as if from another world. A low, hoarse laugh cut through the air, and Jose felt his heart race. He turned his gaze back to the sarcophagus. The lid was now completely open, although he hadn't moved it. The body that had been there moments ago had disappeared. He barely had time to react when he felt a presence behind him. Turning quickly, his flashlight illuminated a figure standing a few meters away. It was a tall man, dressed in a white suit, yellowed with age. The face was partially disfigured, with decaying flesh revealing bone. But what terrified Jose the most were the eyes, or the absence of them. Where the eyes should have been, there were only black holes, deep as an abyss. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a step toward him, and the radio began to hiss again, now emitting distant screams. Jose stepped back, stumbling on the steps of the mausoleum entrance. Panicked, he finally found his voice and began to run. He ran with all his strength, ignoring the fact that his flashlight now barely lit the path ahead of him. The shadows of the graves seemed to stretch and contort, as if they were following him. When he reached the cemetery gate, he noticed something that took his breath away. The path he had walked so many times was different. It was as if the graves had shifted, forming a labyrinth around him. Desperate, he tried to open the gate, but the key he always carried with him was gone. He was trapped. Behind him, he heard the slow, dragging footsteps of the eyeless man approaching. Jose, with no other option, tried to climb the tall gate bars, but something held him back. He looked down and saw skeletal hands emerging from the ground, gripping his ankles, pulling him backward. His body was pulled forcefully to the ground, and he felt the cold take over his limbs. The hands dragged him into the darkness between the graves as he screamed for help, but no one was there to hear him. As he was being dragged, the voices on the radio continued, now clearer. He could hear the souls of the dead whispering secrets, calling his name, accusing him of disturbing their eternal rest. However, before he disappeared completely into the darkness, the eyeless man knelt beside Jose, leaning in until their faces were almost touching. Even without eyes, Jose felt the creature watching him, judging him. Then, with a cold sigh, the figure disappeared, and the hands that held him crumbled into dust. Jose lay there, collapsed on the ground, panting and terrified, not understanding what had just happened. The next morning, the gravediggers found Jose's flashlight lying near the gate, but he was never seen again. The radio, however, continued to emit a faint transmission, with voices whispering, repeating his name endlessly. Since then, Angel Hill Cemetery has been known to be cursed, and no one dares work there at night anymore. Story 2. The Cemetery of the Eternals. Arnaldo Xavier. Arnaldo Xavier was a robust and practical man, accustomed to the busy streets of Sao Paulo. He wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or superstitions, which is why he accepted the job as a night watchman at the Cemetery of the Eternals without hesitation. The place, famous for being one of the largest and oldest in the city, was known for its beautiful sculptures and imposing mausoleums. On the night when everything began, the stifling heat of November made the air feel heavy, almost oppressive. Arnaldo, with his flashlight in hand, was doing his rounds through the narrow, shadowy corridors between the graves. The full moon lit part of the path but left other areas engulfed in deep darkness. As he passed near the section of older graves, Arnaldo noticed something strange. A distant figure standing in front of a tomb he knew well. It was the tomb of the Alvarez family, whose history was filled with tragedy. He squinted, trying to see better. It appeared to be a man, but something was wrong. The figure wasn't standing on the ground. It was floating slightly, as if its feet weren't touching the earth. Arnaldo blinked in disbelief. He tried to convince himself it was just an illusion caused by the heat and moonlight, but when he looked again, the figure was still there, unmoving. A chill ran down his spine, something he had never experienced before, not even in the darkest alleys of the city. "Hey, what are you doing there?" he shouted, trying to sound authoritative. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Arnaldo began walking toward it, his flashlight trembling in his hand, and when he was just a few meters away, the figure simply disappeared, as if it had never been there. Arnaldo stopped abruptly, his eyes scanning the area. He stepped forward and shone the light on the tomb where the figure had been. His mouth went dry when he saw the name engraved on the headstone. It was his own name, Arnaldo Xavier, accompanied by the date of the following day. Fear started to grip him. He rubbed his eyes, thinking he was imagining things. When he looked again, the name had changed, as if nothing strange had happened. But the unease remained, lodged deep in his stomach. He turned around, determined to end his round early that night. However, before he could take a few more steps, a child's laugh echoed through the cemetery. He froze. The laugh wasn't joyful. It was distorted, unsettling. He quickly swung his flashlight around, searching for the source of the sound, and saw a girl. She was wearing a white dress, dirty with mud, and her long black hair covered part of her face. The girl ran between the tombs, slipping effortlessly between the statues and crosses. "Hey girl, come back here," Arnaldo shouted, his fear now replaced with concern. No child should be in the cemetery at that hour. But the girl didn't stop. She kept running, laughing, disappearing into the darkness. Arnaldo decided to follow her, even though every part of his body was telling him not to. He ran, hearing his footsteps echo on the stone ground, and soon spotted the girl standing in front of an old iron cross, a structure he rarely visited. The moonlight illuminated the small figure of the girl, who now stared at him. Her eyes shone unusually, almost supernaturally. "You shouldn't be here," she said, in a low voice that didn't sound like a child's. Arnaldo hesitated, confused. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The girl smiled, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was something macabre, filled with malice. Suddenly, she vanished like dust in the wind, leaving Arnaldo alone in front of the cross. A sound began to echo through the cemetery, the sound of chains dragging across the stone ground. Arnaldo looked around, terror growing inside him. The shadows seemed to stretch, contorting as if they had a life of their own. The trees swayed violently, though there was no wind. The statues, which had once seemed harmless, now had distorted, malicious expressions, as if mocking him. He took a few steps back, trying to distance himself from that place. Fog began to form, dense and suffocating, limiting his vision to only a few meters ahead. The sound of the chains grew louder, and he felt something cold brush against his skin. Hands, invisible hands, touched him, gripping his shoulders, pulling him in different directions. Arnaldo stumbled and fell to his knees, his heart pounding wildly. He screamed for help, but the only responses were whispers, indistinct voices coming from all sides. He felt the cold intensify, as if something was draining his life force. The voices began to form words, revealing dark secrets, mentioning names Arnaldo had never heard before. Among the whispers, he recognized one voice, the girl's voice. She called his name, mocking him, repeating that he shouldn't be here. In desperation, he tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't respond. Fear and cold paralyzed him. The shadows closed in, slowly engulfing him, while the girl's laughter grew louder. Just when all seemed lost, the first rays of sunlight began to appear on the horizon. The soft light pierced through the fog, dissipating the shadows and silencing the voices. Arnaldo felt the invisible hands release him, and the cemetery returned to its state of calm. Cemetery workers found Arnaldo shortly after dawn, collapsed near the cross. He was unconscious, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. There were handprints on his shoulders, as if something had held him during the night. When Arnaldo finally woke, he was confused and terrified. He couldn't explain what had happened, but he knew it wasn't a product of his imagination. He refused to return to work, claiming that the cemetery was no longer safe. Days later, he was admitted to a psychiatric clinic, haunted by the memories of that night. He repeatedly muttered the name of the girl, Maria of the Shadows, saying that she was waiting for him, that one day she would come back to take him. Since then, the Cemetery of the Eternals has gained new fame. They say that, on nights of the full moon, little Maria of the Shadows appears, running between the graves, playing with anyone daring enough to disturb her. Arnaldo Xavier's tomb, though he is still alive, remains empty, waiting for the day of his arrival. Story 3. The Tomb of Secrets. João Costa. João Costa was a simple man with little education but an insatiable curiosity. Ever since he took the job as a watchman at the Parque de Saudade Cemetery in Salvador, he felt it was the perfect job. The place, though somber, was peaceful, and the sound of the distant sea always relaxed him during his long night shifts. However, in August of that year, something different lingered in the air. The night was exceptionally clear, and the full moon illuminated every detail of the marble tombstones and statues. There was something almost magical about the lighting, but it was also deeply unsettling. The shadows cast by the graves seemed longer and more distorted, creating strange shapes that danced as he walked. João began his round as usual, checking the graves closest to the gate. Everything seemed in order until, as he passed through the section with the oldest graves, he heard a sound that made him stop. It was like the sound of something metallic being dragged, a harsh and disturbing noise. He followed the sound to one of the oldest graves in the cemetery. There, among the moss-covered tombstones, was the grave of the Souza family, one of the first families to be buried there. To his amazement, the tombstone was displaced, and the coffin lid was partially open. João approached, his heart pounding harder. Vandals, he immediately thought. He decided he would report the incident the next day, but something made him hesitate. There was something unusual about the scene. The coffin didn't look old and worn as it should have. Instead, it was in perfect condition. With his flashlight in hand, he illuminated the inside of the coffin, and what he saw made his blood freeze. Inside was a woman, not a decayed corpse, but a young woman with pale skin and black hair. She was lying there, her eyes closed, as if merely asleep. But João knew that was impossible. This woman should have been dead for centuries. As he tried to process what he was seeing, the woman slowly opened her eyes. João stepped back with a stifled scream. Her eyes were completely white, with no pupils, and her vacant gaze locked directly on him. She sat up in the coffin with a slow, unnatural movement, as if she were not bound by the laws of physics. Panic overtook João, who stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. He tried to run, but his feet felt glued to the ground, as if the cemetery itself was trying to hold him. He looked back and saw the woman rising fully out of the coffin. She floated slightly, her bare feet not touching the ground. The woman began to move toward him, her movements smooth but terrifyingly fast. With his heart racing, João finally managed to move and ran as fast as he could toward the guardhouse. The sound of the wind and waves seemed to disappear, replaced by a deathly silence. When he reached the guardhouse, he slammed the door shut and tried to catch his breath. But as he looked out the small window, he saw the woman standing outside, floating, her white eyes fixed on him. Her face showed no emotion, but something about those cold features made him feel an overwhelming presence. He locked the door, but he knew it was futile. She was something beyond human understanding. The radio in the guardhouse began to hiss, interrupting his thoughts. At first, it was just static, but soon voices began to emerge from the noise. They were low, indistinct whispers, but filled with a malice he could not describe. He turned off the radio, but the voices continued. Desperate, he looked at the woman outside. Now she was closer, almost touching the window. The shadows around her seemed to twist and come to life, like black serpents. Suddenly, the glass of the window began to crack. João backed away, feeling despair grip his body. The woman raised a skeletal hand and touched the cracked glass. As soon as she did, the glass shattered completely, scattering across the floor of the guardhouse. João knew he could no longer stay there. He ran through the back door of the guardhouse, feeling the cold, damp night air on his face. The cemetery was silent, but he knew he was not alone. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The shadows seemed to follow him as he ran toward the exit. He could barely breathe, the fear suffocating him. Each step felt heavier than the last. As he neared the cemetery gate, he noticed something that sent him into total panic. The gate was closed, and the key he always carried in his pocket was no longer there. He looked around, trying to find another way out, but it seemed the cemetery had transformed into a labyrinth. The graves had shifted, and the statues seemed to have turned their heads, watching him as he tried to escape. In the center of the cemetery, where there had previously only been ordinary graves, now stood a black and imposing mausoleum. It was a structure João had never seen before, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. The door to the mausoleum was ajar, and a faint yellowish light emanated from within. The woman was now standing in front of the mausoleum, as if inviting him in. João didn't want to, but he knew he had no other option. The cemetery was surrounding him, trapping him. With hesitant steps, He approached the entrance, feeling the cold grow with every step. Inside, he was greeted by a large hall, with walls covered in ancient inscriptions and symbols he couldn't understand. In the center was a black stone coffin, closed. The woman stood beside it, now smiling. Her teeth were sharp, and the smile was distorted. Before he could react, the lid of the coffin opened on its own, and a figure emerged from within. It was a man, tall, with gray skin and completely black eyes, with no trace of humanity. He rose slowly and looked directly at Joao, as if he had been waiting for him for a long time. Joao tried to back away, but the man extended his hand and, without touching him, caused his body to be pulled toward the coffin. The air around him became dense and suffocating. He screamed, but his voice was muffled by the mausoleum's walls. As the man drew closer, Joao felt a sharp pain in his chest. It was as if his soul was being forcibly torn from his body. He tried to fight, but his body no longer responded. All he could see were the man's black eyes, filled with darkness. The next morning, the cemetery was peaceful. The staff found the guardhouse destroyed, but there was no sign of Joao. Some said he fled, while others believed he was taken by something he was never meant to find. The black mausoleum, however, had vanished, and no one mentioned the woman with white eyes again. But at night, the shadows still danced in the Parquet de Saudade, as if something was lurking, waiting.